Mr. Bennett, Professor Schöpflin, thank you for coming here and thank you for the possibility of this debate. This debate is organized by the Danube Institute, and we hope that it will be an interesting debate for all the readers and all the viewers of this video. For all the viewers who did not read Mr. Bennett and your colleague Mr. Lotus's article in the Hungarian Review, first it would be great if you could sum up the main points, main statements of your article.
Yes, thank you. The article is primarily an attempt to bring into the discussion on contemporary politics, and particularly the situation of Europe, the recent developments in the social sciences, particularly the work of the Cambridge group headed by the most prominent member of which is McFarland, and the French demographer Emmanuel Todd, who's at the National Institute of Demographic Studies in Paris. These people do not say exactly the same thing, but it's a very mutually supporting set of arguments. And in fact, Todd studied at Cambridge when McFarland was involved there, and they knew each other then. So this is an evolving school coming out of the historical anthropology people at Cambridge, primarily in the anthropology department at King's College, and it's been referred to sometimes as the continuity school. And this is, we'll get into this when we discuss the matter of stages again and a bit further on, but the main point they make is that the distinguishing characteristics of English liberal democratic capitalist society, as it's been developing over the past few centuries, had roots in the nature of English society going back, documented as far as the 1300s, but based on archaeological evidence, this is consistent with the development of English society before that, into the 900s and possibly back into the 700s. The pre-literate record, the argument based on archaeology rather than written records, primarily comes out of Professor James Campbell at Oxford, who is sort of one of the founders of the continuity school. McFarland was a student of Campbell's at Oxford. And Campbell's primary work here is The Anglo-Saxon State, published some decades ago at this point, looking at the differences that are visible in Anglo-Saxon society versus the continent, the origin of a substantially different type of feudalism, having been based in Anglo-Saxon society, the larger role of coined money in English society even before the Norman invasion compared to the continent, estimating based on archaeological remains that the volume of silver money in England was about 10 times per capita what it was on the continent, even prior to the Norman conquest, indicating that market relations were much more important in English society even at that time than in the feudal pre-manorial and manorial economies. Now, this is contrary to the generally accepted picture in the social sciences over the previous 100 years. So it's, in anthropological terms, it's a bit of an intellectual revolution. McFarland, of course, is best known for his 1977 work, The Origins of English Individualism, in which basically refuted the idea that there was a transition from the Gemeinschaftliche Gesellschaft society around the 1600s, as the Marxist school of sociology had always assumed, showing that land in England was individually owned back as far as records indicate, which is about the 14th century, and every indication is it was individually owned in the majority of areas, because England was not consistent any more than any other place was. That inheritance was at will, the will of the testator. That written wills developed in England well before the others, because there was no absolute specified form of inheritance. Primogeniture was brought over primarily by the Normans, and only ever applied to the upper classes primarily. And therefore, that individual contractual relations, the so-called Lockean type of society, was not a new invention of the late Middle Ages or early modern ages. It was a feature of English society from the beginning, and this was not true on the continent. Todd's particular contribution to this is to look into the idea of family systems as underlying these changes. In other words, McFarland and his group, and Ernst Gellner, the Czech-British anthropologist who was McFarland's mentor at Cambridge, were concentrating primarily on what was the result in terms of human relations, market relations, etc., political structures, and particularly the growth of civil society in 14th to 16th century England, in the sense of entities growing up that were neither state nor church, but existed in a third space between the state and the church, and enabled by structures peculiar to common law. It's another important part of the argument. And here McFarland did an interesting thing of going back to the 19th century British scholars on common law, particularly Frederick Maitland at Cambridge, and sort of linking up their analysis of the legal evolution of the law to the sociological and anthropological analysis. McFarland's book, Making of the Modern World, has a set of chapters on Maitland and his work and its significance to all this. Todd looks at family structures, particularly the kinship relations, the way people conceive of themselves in relation to their family, and the implications of this to society, particularly the duties owed as a matter of fundamental culture between the individuals in the family, between the father and son, daughter, father and mother, and among siblings.
And in your article, so you stated that these are the different models for there are different models for the continental Europe. So like in Germany, several different models, and they are different than the Anglo-Saxon models. And you stated that England and America used to be the blueprint for the future for the European continents, but it's not a solution anymore. So Europe should find its own roots. And these are mainly based. These might be mainly based on the family structures of these countries, continental countries.
Well, what you say is that the family systems seem to be good predictors of the politics and the social and economic structures of the countries over a great deal of time. Todd goes into this in a good deal of detail, both in his original book, Troisième Monde, and his subsequent articles in journalism, although he's known more for his popular journalism, which derives from this but doesn't explain it very well. You have to go to his demographics books to really understand what's going on. There's been a school of analysis growing up around Todd's work. Gilles Duranton, French demographer, did a series of papers along with some colleagues, sponsored by the European Union starting in 1991. He did a very interesting paper on family systems as predictors of labor mobility in Western Europe. And if you look at the maps, you see that the family systems areas are very good predictors for the politics coming out of this. And
one of the main points of your debate and your answer to Mr. Bennett's and Mr. Lawson's article was exactly the role of the family structures in the history of the different European countries. You have a different point of view in this role.
Yes, I do have a different perspective on this. First of all, I don't accept the rigid dichotomy that you've established between Anglo-Saxon and continental. I think there are many other factors that are involved. One of the factors that does differentiate England, I stress England, not Britain, it doesn't apply to Wales, doesn't apply to Scotland, let alone Ireland, is that you have the Norman conquest, which is a break, but it does impose a centralised system with a single judiciary. That's not paralleled anywhere else. And that provides the security, for example, for the written wills that you've discussed. The centralization in France, which happens a little later, doesn't generate this very homogenized system. That is where England is different. But it seems to me that you actually have something coming from much earlier. This is the work of Deepak Lal, who may be of Indian origin but is an American, so he should know, the Anglo-Saxons as well, is that the Roman Catholic Church introduced, under canon law governs law of succession and heritage, introduced a provision that there can only be inheritance upwards or downwards, not sideways. And because male heirs only, no women at that particular time, very often, maybe 40% of families die intestate, and no one to inherit, no male heir, so the money goes to the church as the ultimate heir. This results in the accumulation of great wealth in the hands of the Catholic Church. So I would say that Western Christianity is actually different. There are all sorts of other things in Western Christianity, like no Caesar papism and so on. But I would say, as far as family structures are concerned, this is where the British Isles, which are parts of Western Christianity, whether they like it or not, is actually quite like the rest of Europe. There are then differences, and here I would say that the central difference is to what extent the political system is capable of providing the security which allows for the family to relax. Otherwise, the family becomes the primary unit of security. And if we go out of Europe, then we actually see where the state is arbitrary, capricious, unreliable. We have the extended family. The Middle East is actually incomprehensible without understanding that actually these are extended family states. I think the same applies to China, same applies to India. Europe is the exception, and here I don't think that the distinction between England and the rest of the continent is so important. As far as continuity and discontinuity are concerned, well, I think there really are methodological and perceptual distinctions to be made. I see history as a series of discontinuities. If we don't have discontinuities, we don't have a theory of change. Things do change over time. Even in my own lifetime, I've seen really quite far-reaching changes. So it seems to me that we cannot look at this only in terms of continuity. I accept, of course, there are things which resemble 13th century. Let me give you one example. It's going to be very important between now and mid-September. 1320, Declaration of Arbroath. This is a declaration by the Scottish nobility about the independence of Scotland. Scottish nationalists today cite this as an example of we were independent-minded even in the 14th century. Actually, this has nothing to do with that. It's the Scottish nobility which is declaring its independence from the English crown. But you can muddle these things and say, look, we've been doing this for 6 centuries. It's a load of codswallop. The world was very different 6 centuries ago to what it is now. And if you don't accept that, then what are we talking about? So that's my first broad point. My second point is that as far as the economic centre of medieval Europe is concerned, I'm interested in your argument about the quantity of money, but if you look at it, the centre of economic power was this triangle or quadrilateral between northern Italy, so Lombardy, Florence, Tuscany, southern Germany, the South German towns are very wealthy, Paris, a key centre, and Flanders. The first stock exchange is actually set up in Bruges in 1306. Not in England. Although trade with England, the wool staple is there in Fera very early on, Flushing and so on. So what I'm suggesting to you is that actually if we're looking at the pattern of inheritance, the family pattern, and the corresponding wealth and the security and the transmission, I don't see a real distinction. Some of the patterns are different, crucially because of Roman law. Roman law brings with it a system. This is inherited, it's transmitted, it creates a security. It functions differently from so-called common law. I have a legal background, but as a matter of fact, it's in Scotland, where we have a mixed system. So I'm familiar both with the common law and with the Roman law. So I would suggest that the distinctions aren't that great. And as far as the family system is concerned, again, there are particular happenstances, accidents of chance, which do actually mean that, to some extent, what McFarland argues, which a book I did read a very long time ago, is viable. But I would say, no, it's actually rather different from that, and I'm not sure that on its own the family structure really tells us much more than it does about the family, and not much more.
What do you think about it?
Well, I think what he's saying is not untrue, but the thing is, well, the way McFarland puts it is that there is a series of separations or discontinuities in world culture, degrees of differentiation, starting with the first one between Africa and the people that left Africa, etc., the East Asian from the rest of the world, Indo-Europeans from the other cultures of Eurasia, and finally Western Europe versus the rest of the world, which is significant, as you point out. Latin Christianity had some unique characteristics, and particularly throughout all of Latin Christianity had this suppression of cousin marriage and the requirement for outmarriage. And Todd also stresses the importance of exogamy versus endogamy in producing outward-looking societies where people reach out and form non-kin relations with other people. And all of Western Europe shares this heritage, to be sure. And Hungary is on the right side of that line. This is also similar to John Haenel's line on the manorial economy versus the communitarian agricultural economies. His so-called Haenel line runs through Eastern Europe, but also through the middle of Italy. And this line is a very good predictor of who modernized in the 19th century versus who modernized in the 20th century, if at all. It's a very significant line. And, of course, England and continental Europe are in the same category in there. McFarland just believes that there is a further significant separation between England, and you're right, it is England and maybe eastern Scotland, which is the heaviest Anglo-Saxon settlement area, versus the Celtic outer areas, that we're really talking about England and parts of southern and eastern Scotland as the final differentiator. Because there is all this commonality in the next to the last separation, you have both significant similarities. And now the question of how important is family systems versus other important things, religion, culture, language, etc., I would think what we're talking about is family systems as an similar and equally weighted factor with culture and language and religion. And obviously these are interactive because family systems is part of culture. But typically when people are looking at national differences, they analyze it almost entirely linguistic, cultural, and structural issues. And what Todd has been saying, and what I agree with, is that family systems needs to be thrown in as a co-equal factor in analysis. So therefore you can look, typically you'll see a map trying to create typologies of different societies in Western Europe, and you'll see, all right, there's the Protestant Catholic line, there is the Roman law versus common law line, etc., etc. You typically don't see a family systems line, but I think the family system line can be a good predictor of at least why some attempts to build states or political structures across linguistic or other types of cultural lines succeed or fail. Because attempts to build states across lines of different family systems, unless one is clearly dominant over the other, so it can put its imprint on all of society, these societies have been more problematic. And you see all the historical trouble areas in Europe often coincide with the domination of one family system and a minority of another family system, even when the language is the same or similar.
Now we can go on with our debate with a second.
I would just like to add one other couple of factors to this debate on family structure. First of all, nobody has yet mentioned the F word, feudalism, which is universal in Western Christianity. Feudalism, we can say a great deal about it, but basically it's a way of structuring land ownership, ensuring that all the land is somebody's, which then necessarily results in there being some forms of arbitration, and a hierarchy allowing for mobilization of resources for war. Now, it seems to me that in Western Europe, it's somewhat different once you go east of the Elbe, but not very. Each individual will have an idea of who their feudal superior is. They probably won't know who the monarch is. The family fits into that, and actually the feudal structure is structured around the family. So I'm suggesting that there's much greater continuity here throughout Europe, and that includes England as well as much of Europe west of the Elbe. As far as national heritage are concerned, well, I think we could have a very long series of debates about exactly what culture is. For me, it's a set of shared meanings, intersecting set of shared meanings. Religion, it seems to me, is a part of this. It structures the way in which we understand the world around us. And as for language, well, we know that language shift until the very recent modern period was very widespread. I don't imagine either of you have read Kalavivik's book, which is available in Hungarian, on the origin of Finno-Ugrian languages, and he argues that actually in the early Bronze Age much of Europe was speaking Finno-Ugrian language. This is gradually overcome because of the Finno-Ugrians were pastoralists and they were driven northwards by settled agriculture. We of course came into this game much later. We only arrived much after this. We in Hungary, we are an anomaly, which Kalvivik discusses. So it seems to me that there are all sorts of contingent factors which actually affect family structure. Family structure on its own is one sociological factor, but really no more than that. And I myself would be uneasy about structuring an entire... it doesn't bear the burden that at the moment is expected to carry in Mr. Bennett's model. Oh, and one other point about France. You may know W.H. Neal's argument that because of the very long Napoleonic wars and the very large number of French soldiers who took part in it, they came home with considerable knowledge of contraceptive techniques, in consequence of which they were limiting family size by the 19th century. Otherwise, family size was being limited by disease, infant mortality, until you get Semmelweis in the second half of the 19th century. Puerperal fever is gradually eliminated.
Thank you. The second part of our debate is the debate around the concept of developmental stages. You mentioned that it's not just the Marxism, but it is before it was the Christianity and also the Enlightenment who shared this concept of developmental stages, and versus the continuity model. What do you think about this clash of these two models by understanding Europe?
Well, I think that we go back to the key point of the stage model is one basically where society is, in general, all human society, or at least all Western European society, started at one stage, went through the same stages at different points because of, well, there's all sorts of arguments as to why one gets the transition before the other. The continuity model says that basically England was had a different system from an extremely early age, never went through the preceding stage, or in the English case, because of the Norman conquest, had aspects of a continental society imposed on it, developed the system of written wills and common law mechanisms, basically to frustrate the attempt to impose full continental feudalism on England. This is an important part of McFarland's chapters on Maitland and the Making of the Modern World. And basically England was not so much going through a stage as returning to norm as the individual will and the non-fixed patterns of inheritance basically spread back from the middle classes to the upper classes. although the topmost layer of the upper classes kept primogeniture into the 20th century, but it was something that was always unpopular in the lower levels. So that's a model of long-standing differences in different parts of Europe, and rather than being developmental stages that happened automatically, which is a perceptual matter, it's a matter of influences from one region into the other, which wax and wane according to basic historical factors. So, but just wanted to return to a point you brought up in the previous section very quickly. I did try to inject feudalism and the manorial economy indirectly through the work of John Haenel, because his basic point was that there was a difference, very substantial difference between Western Europe and the rest of the world because of the existence of the manorial economy. I would only say that it expressed itself quite differently in England than on the continent because of the specific ethnic factor of it being imposed through the Norman conquest rather than growing up because of indigenous factors as it did on the continent. But going back to the stages issue, I think that the stages concept imposes too much determinism on the picture we have how society develops, and creates an expectation that other societies will at some point for some reason go through these stages automatically. I think this is one of the problems that's happened between the encounter between European-derived civilizations, Europe and America, and the rest of the world, is that for at least the past century or so, we've gone in to other countries, whether as colonialists or foreign aid or international businessmen or the IMF, and expecting that this society will go through these stages if we can just force it to. And in many, many cases, this has not been happening. And the reason it's not been happening is, as you say, about the Middle East and the extended family system, especially the endogamous marriage system they've had there, that they're not pre-positioned to go through the stage, and they won't go through the stage barring very great social change or cultural change, and it's not clear where this change is going to come from. So I think that you can say it's an unsophisticated understanding of the stages theory, but it is the stages theory that's causing this misunderstanding of what can be done, what will be done in the third world.
What is your point of view?
Well, in my own time, at various times, I have been attracted by stages, but today I take the view that it's deterministic. It diminishes choice. It effectively means you don't have agency. It means that, there's a stage, it's tough, you've got to go through it. If you're looking at it from the point of view of Hungary, we've got to go through various stages before we get to, where is it we've got to go? Oh, the United States or England or, well, no, what we want to do is to construct our own way to the future. Now, it seems to me that the classic illustration, I think, of why stages thinking is really very dubious is, you will remember Eugene Rostow's book, Stages of Economic Growth, came out about 1950-something. I was fascinated by it. Okay, I was very young. Maybe I was sort of 17 or something like that when I read that. I thought, yeah, wonderful, It just doesn't work that way. I mean, if we are talking about something like a modernity, and even if we define it as high mass consumption, which I think is the term that he uses, a great deal depends on things like the resource curse. What happens with the money that you happen to accumulate? Think of Azerbaijan, where they have huge quantities of energy carriers. What do they spend it on? Weaponry. Why? Because of Nagorno-Karabakh and so on and so forth. Or think of Taiwan and South Korea, which do make the break out of pre-modernity into a particular type of modernity. They do it partly through the injection of foreign capital from the US, but overwhelmingly they do it through the imposition of a coercive system that extracts native capital primarily from agriculture. It takes about 20 years, but in the 1960s, South Korea was a miserable post-war, devastated country. By 1980, it had pulled ahead of Hungary and the communist system. So this is one of the arguments which devastated communism. So I'm sorry, I don't believe in stages. I don't think there are stages. I'm sometimes fascinated by the idea of cycles, that things go round and round and we get back to where we were, but at a somewhat different level. I'm not sure it's a higher level. But what I certainly do not believe in is that there is a single model of modernity. I don't think you do either, actually.
No, we're agreeing on this.
But I think we're fairly close to each other, which leads me to say that if there is no single model of modernity, and think about how different Japan, a modern society, is from the United States, partly to do with the family structure, but partly to do with Shintoism, the way in which life and death and continuity are understood. In other words, ancestral cults and so on, which we don't have on the whole. We're stronger here maybe in Central Europe than in Anglo-Saxony. But anyway, so what I'm suggesting is that the universalism of the Enlightenment, which casts a terrible shadow over the world, it's on the basis of that Europe, the West, America, conquers the rest of the world, imposes its colonial systems, and to some extent we're the victims of that in Hungary, because we have been forced to adopt, and sometimes to adapt, our ideas, concepts, institutions, which don't grow necessarily out of the native soil. We've sort of adapted them, but then you will be familiar, and I think most of our viewers will be familiar with the term kurusoshobash, the resistance. That this is from outsiders, not ours. We don't like it. We will withstand it, whether it's good for us or not. Simply for the sake of the German word Trotzigkeit comes to mind here.
Here we can turn to the third point, because the time passes by and we don't have too much time anymore.
Yes.
This is the local history of Hungary and Central Europe, and it's the heritage of Austria-Hungary. You have, as I read, you have a little bit different points of views in that, and it is very interesting that maybe you have a more positive view on the Austria-Hungary, the Habsburg Empire, than Mr. Schöpflin. What is your point of view of this heritage of Austria-Hungary, and how can it be used in the future of the Central European countries?
Well, actually, I will have the disclaimer that I am not an expert in Austro-Hungarian history or Hungarian history. What I was trying to do was to suggest it's worth taking another look at that model and asking ourselves how it might have evolved had it not been cut short by the war. Because one thing that interests me looking into history, I like to look at models not taken, models proposed but never taken. And the interesting thing to me are the various proposals for reform of the Austro-Hungarian Empire along federal lines that were being proposed, well, basically from the Ausgleich to the end of World War I. When it became a moot point.
Comes up with that much earlier in the 19th century. The ideas of a Danubian confederation do go right back. And Jerzy Plodjachravi, king of Czech lands, I've forgotten, 15th century. So these ideas are there.
Yes.
It's not just post-First World War.
Yep. Well, there was a huge amount of discussion in the last half of the 19th century, obviously because of the Hungarian model, and then everybody else in the empire said, well, if the Hungarians can have it, why can't we have it? But looking at some of the proposals, it occurs to me that these may have been more viable ways forward than what actually happened. We will never know, so it's all speculation at this point. But, the Austro-Hungarian Empire was politically latecomer to modernity, to the modern model of the nation-state, etc. You had people right up until 1918 who had basically pre-modern ideas of what a state ought to be, i.e. non-nationalist, or accommodating nationalism through something other than a homogeneous nation-state. I would just think it's interesting looking to the future. Do we say this is somehow a useful model for thinking forward? I don't know. I don't have the answers, but I've always been fascinated by this as one of the things that was proposed but never happened. I'm also, have a good deal of interest in the proposals floated at the end of the 19th century for a federal model for the British Empire. And actually, I'm doing a book on this. This will be one of my next projects. But it's interesting to see that from 1876 onward, Irish nationalists always refer to the Austro-Hungarian Empire as a model for Irish-British relations for a long time, and various other models for Anglo-Saxon federations and such. Would always quote what was going on in Austria-Hungary. So it's interesting that although England was supposedly the beacon of modernity, they kept talking about what was happening on the Danube, although it was partly rhetorical.
Mr. Schöpflin?
That's all the further I could go on that. I'm not trying to claim that the emperor was wonderful or anything.
Let me say a few things here, but in no great detail. I probably do know too much about Austria-Hungary, although I'm not a historian. But it seems to me that by the second half of the 19th century, the national communities are becoming real. The national intelligentsias have succeeded in mobilizing themselves and their populations into particular conceptions of nationhood. By the way, nationhood, of course, is imported from the West. It's not native to the region. It comes in the context of, well, if we don't preserve ourselves, then we disappear. But this is an intolerable idea, although it's a very strong one throughout the region, that our nation will die out, Kölcsei and Herder and so on. Now, Austria-Hungary was, in my opinion, the accumulation of a series of historical accidents held together by some places the monarch, some places the king. Here it was the king. I've been to Madeira several times where the last king of Hungary is buried. There's a rather touching inscription which says, in Latin, Emperor of Austria, Apostolic King of Hungary, King of Bohemia, etc., etc. He had about 20 titles. So in fact, it was an accumulation of lands. If there'd been no First World War, let's go down the counterfactual road. I'm all in favour. Yes, it's possible that it could have been transformed, but I don't know how you democratise an empire. Above all, how do you democratise a multinational empire? Now, you quoted Ernest Gellner earlier on. I knew him very well, and in fact I was present at his last public lecture here in Budapest. Ernest always said the only way you could keep Austria-Hungary together is some kind of light-touch authoritarianism. But I think that by 1918 that was not an offer. And I think that by 1918 Austria-Hungary had no legitimacy, relics of loyalty to the ruler, Kaisertreue, even Königstreue, even some Hungarians were loyal to him, although less so. So I think that there was no alternative. Then the question is Wilson's 14 points, another Western import imposed on us and carried out with maximal ruthlessness and to the great disadvantage of Hungary, which is why there is no Rue Clemenceau in Budapest.
We have almost at the end of our debate. Just some minutes for the last topic. And this we are talking about empires and democratization. And maybe it will be interesting to talk about the European Union and the future of the European Union and its democratization. So how do you see the crisis of the EU and the way out of this crisis? And only in some sentences at the end of our debate.
Well, okay, just a very few sentences, and obviously I'm an interested party in this. And I hope to remain an interested party even after the 25th of May. I don't have to explain what I'm talking about. People misunderstand the European Union and see it as an economic entity. It isn't. From the outset, it was political. It's among other things, it is a method of conflict resolution. It's a way of ensuring there will always be conflict. The myth of harmony is completely destructive. So the problem is not how to eliminate conflict, but how to resolve it in such a way that all the affected parties are satisfied with the outcome. In that context, the European Union has done not a bad job. And even if it were only economic, you still need single standards set somewhere. You need food safety standards, for example. You need a certain amount of legal certainty throughout the area, like the single patent, which is a big issue at the moment. And for that, you need a degree of central administration. Is it done well? Is it done badly? Well, the last 10 years I've been in the European Parliament, I've seen a great deal of nonsense. A lot of stuff I think is actually very counterproductive, but at the end of the day I would still say the costs of non-Europe are higher than having whatever we have. And here I would add one thing. The perspective on Europe will always be different for a small state to a large state.
What do you think about it?
Well, I think that the problem of the European Union is actually quite similar to the problem you described of reforming the Austro-Hungarian Empire at its end, except from the other way around. There you had a functioning multinational polity. The problem was how to make it democratic. With Europe, you have a group of democratic nations, and the question is how to make it a functional multinational polity. And the conclusion in the Austro-Hungarian case was, in the end, you could not square the circle. It's possible to square the circle in the European case because the democracy is genuine and successful. However, you have this problem of accountability versus, democratic legitimacy. And we'll just take the question of the European Parliament. It's not a real parliament as we would understand it because it doesn't have budgetary authority. But when you ask people, would you like to give it budgetary authority, a great many national people say...
That's the one thing we do have. We do have budgetary authority. The EU budget can't go on without Parliament voting it. There are other things which are missing, but European Parliament actually has a great deal of power under the Lisbon Treaty.
Has it ever been used?
I'm sorry?
Has it ever been used?
Yes, we've threatened the Commission with all sorts of things, the constant arguments, constant battles. Now, on this I have to be quite firm. We do have budgetary powers, we do use them, and then it's a very interesting question, will the next Parliament have a blocking minority of Eurosceptics, in which case the budgetary authority, who knows what can do.
But you don't have tax-raising authority.
We have customs which do come to us, but this is quite correct. The member states will not allow us to have our own resources. It's a big issue.
Well, I think it's the issue in the sense of if you're going to get to democratic legitimacy by having an elected parliament with tax-raising authority, at the same time, many of the national populations would not approve of that. So basically you were at a conundrum.
So basically you're saying we have representation without taxation.
Yes.
Yes, I think that's right.
And this is true. And you have a moment of decision coming up, I think, whether the European Union is going to be a relatively decentralized entity without a central tax-raising state, i.e. what it's been to date, maybe even backing off a little, or whether it's going to forge ahead to be a true multinational federation.
Well,
without the British
watch
in
this
that case,
space. I would say there's very likely to be a convention in 2016 when these issues will be debated and nobody knows the outcome.
Okay,
yes.
Because time is right now. Thank you for the debate, Mr. Bennett and Professor Schöpflin. We can go on in a later time.
Thank you very much. My pleasure.
We can certainly go on forever, but unfortunately I have to go to shower now.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.